Welcome to the California Sun Podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. Every world-class city boasts a landmark or building that transcends its physical presence, symbolizing the broader narrative of the city itself, a kind of portal that offers insights far beyond the structure alone. In the eyes of my guest, John King, the acclaimed and longtime urban design critic and two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist, the Ferry Building in San Francisco is one such emblematic place. John King has been a prominent figure at the San Francisco Chronicle since 1992, and he joins us today to discuss his latest work, Portal, San Francisco's Ferry Building and the Reinvention of American Cities. But Portal is more than a mere chronicle. It's an eye-opening journey where architecture collides with civic aspirations. The book depicts how the rise, fall, and rebirth of a single edifice can mirror the tumultuous saga of a city and, more broadly, urban America. The narrative begins in 1898 with the grand opening of San Francisco's Ferry Building. More than just a transportation hub, it stood as a monumental gateway connecting San Francisco to the wider world. Yet even this iconic structure would endure years of neglect, overshadowed by freeways, ultimately witnessing its resurgence as a cherished landmark. John King's book, Portal, is an exploration of urban challenges, addressing the existential threats that the Ferry Building and similar waterfront areas worldwide face today, from climate change to seismic risks. It offers insights into the delicate balance between preservation, development, and adaptation. It's the story of how a single structure can encapsulate a city's past, present, and uncertain future. It is my pleasure to welcome John King here to talk about Portal, San Francisco's Ferry Building and the Reinvention of American Cities. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Jeff, thank you. I wish I could sum the book up as are my aspirations for the book as well as you did.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind words. Talk first about this building and when it was built. Back in kind of the Gilded Age, 1898, as I mentioned, what was the idea for, what was thought about when this building came to be?
We tend to forget it now, but San Francisco in the late 19th century was a very big American city. It was the 8th largest city in terms of population in the nation. It was the only city of any real size still on the West Coast. So it was a major city known around the world. It also had the reputation of being a Wild West kind of town, booms and busts. It got burnt down by fire on repeated occasions. All sorts of kind of vigilante justice kicked in from time to time. And so the Ferry Building was part of a larger shift by city leaders to try and really send the message, we are a major global city. We are a cultured, European-styled regional capital. We are a real American city, just like New York, just like Boston, just like Philadelphia. And at the time, every big city had a big train depot that was kind of where you came to town, and it put on a show. So San Francisco wanted one, except it was on the edge of water on three sides. So a train depot was kind of irrelevant. So it turned into the grandest ferry depot in the country.
These train depots, these iconic buildings that somehow came to represent the aspirations of cities, I mean, it was really a very European concept, first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. And like so much of America in the 19th century, it started in Europe, and then big East Coast cities with lots of wealth and an eye to Europe began imitating them, and then every aspirational city further to the west kind of scurried to face that. So you're right. It's one thing that San Franciscans in the first decades of the 20th century liked to boast was that the Ferry Building was busier than any depot in the world except for Charing Cross Station in London. You know, just for the volume of people coming in and out of it, upwards of 50 million people a year. And it's interesting because so many of these train depots were privately built. So you had all these railroad empires trying to one-up each other. And the difference with the Ferry Building is it was publicly built. The waterfront of San Francisco at the time was owned by the state. So this was a state project. It actually had to be financed by a vote on the statewide ballot in 1892. It passed by a grand total of 800 votes. So it is very grand in its gestures. It was never as opulently detailed as if you went to Grand Central Station or some of the Union stations sprinkled through the Midwest. But from the beginning, it wanted to be a big, important building.
What were if any, the controversies that surrounded the building of it? Like any urban project, there's always people that are against something.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the things that I really was fascinated by in the research for the book. And I spent a fair amount of time in the book, but a lot more was left on the virtual cutting room floor. And that is that, at least going back to the 1890s, every big infrastructure project tends to be wildly controversial as it proceeds. The ferry building, it narrowly passed, but it had nothing to do with the project. It was more kind of state chasms, and people didn't like Southern Pacific Railroad and things, which was the lead occupant of the ferry slips. But the design was unveiled. Everyone said, this is great. This is what San Francisco wants. We love it. And then it's an engineering fiasco. It's not well designed. It's too expensive. The construction is shoddy. It's just like the fights over high-speed rail. It's just like in the Bay Area, the controversy that surrounded the building of the east span of the Bay Bridge. It's how things happen in the country, because you start getting the political factions that can jump on this. You get politicians trying to come up who can use that as a way to slag other people. You get media, then newspapers, doing the equivalent of how do we get the clicks. It's kind of, there were 5 or 6 competing daily newspapers in San Francisco. So they all were playing up the controversies from one direction or another. They were attacking each other about how the ferry building project was being covered. It's how things sadly work in America.
Was there a way in which the controversy, and you have a great sense of this, having covered architecture and urban design for so long, sometimes the controversy makes the project better. Did the ferry building get better or worse from the controversy?
I think the ferry building got better for the controversy. I say it with a hesitant tone in my voice because one big change since then is just how public process works. So the building that got built was essentially the building that was proposed. And at the time, the project seemed to go on forever, but voters approved the idea of the project in 1892. The architect, A. Page Brown, unfurled his plans, this gigantic 6-foot-long watercolor painting, in January of 1893, and the thing opened 5.5 years later. And also I should mention at 2 different points there were lawsuits that stopped the project in its tracks. Again, the American way. So there was kind of a clarity to the procession. But I think that on the whole it made it better because the changes that came about through the controversy mostly had to do with money, and so it's like big wings were chopped off at the end. The building's 600 feet long, but it would have been, I think, 850 feet long if the full thing had been built. It would have been a grander building at the ends. That said, it would have been a little too pompous. So if anything, the controversy and the attention on keeping to the budget did not hurt the building, and it did not hurt the waterfront in the long run.
And talk about how it was viewed when it was completed.
I could have written a whole different book on the cultural use of the ferry building. It was fascinating. It was, now it's this wonderful remnant of the 19th century, and those were the old days in San Francisco. In the early 20th century, the ferry building was this symbol of modernity, showing not just that San Francisco was a big fancy city or saw itself that way, but that it had cutting-edge technology. The foundation, no one had ever built anything like it. And then I loved discovering this by the fluke of a postcard. The Ferry Building was actually replicated at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair as the San Francisco building. There was this little street lined with buildings representing different cities, and there was a mock ferry building with a 70-foot tall tower. Just things like that were fun, but there were an enormous number of postcards that were done with it. The 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition, which was done to show the world that San Francisco had recovered from the earthquake, that was up kind of in the marina and where the Presidio is now. But the point of entry was the Ferry Building, and it had a big sign on it. It pops up in movies and souvenirs from the World's Fair, because it really served as the gateway to this international extravaganza.
Were there other buildings, other places in San Francisco that somehow felt slighted by the fact that the Ferry Building became the iconography of the city for a long time?
Right. The city was changing so abruptly at the time that one of the beauties of the Ferry Building is it's isolated, and that's been a curse at times in its history, but it stands by itself off on the waterfront. And at the time it was built, if you went inland, there was a produce market. So downtown, the financial district area started like 5 or 6 blocks away. So I don't think there were other buildings that felt slighted. There were other efforts to show off and kind of maybe excel or exceed over it. But it was never the tallest building in the city, because one of the newspapers, the Call, built a tower. It was the Call building. It was the Spreckles building. It still exists, though very stripped down, at 3rd and Market Street. And you had newspaper titans trying to build fancier buildings than other newspaper titans. But the Ferry Building stood apart from all that. And then there was the struggle to be the biggest thing around. And then the 1906 earthquake leveled almost everything downtown, except for the Ferry Building, which survived. So then the whole focus was on rebuilding. So it's this interesting thing where it symbolized the city. It was the civic icon, but it also stood apart from the fray in very interesting ways.
And yet, as things changed, it became dwarfed by a freeway and virtually disappeared for a very long time.
Well, that's absolutely true. For half a century, it was an obsolete building. Nobody knew what to do with it. First, you had the Bay Bridge and Golden Gate Bridge get built. The Bay Bridge made the building irrelevant in terms of how do you, to dumb it down, how do you get from Boston to downtown San Francisco? It used to be you take the train across the country and then you take a ferry and boom. Now it's just you hop in your car and you drive across and then there's a bridge at the end. The Golden Gate Bridge got built, and that instantly became the visual icon of the city and the region. As soon as that building was built, the Ferry Building just kind of like fell off the map in terms of iconography. And then with the ferry service down to almost nothing and people embracing cars, then you had the state wanting to build convenient elevated freeways. And San Francisco leaders said, well, the first thing we need is a freeway from the Bay Bridge to the Golden Gate Bridge. And so the freeway was going to run along the Embarcadero, curl all the way up, and then cut straight across the city to the Golden Gate Bridge. And only the first segment got built, because once it started getting built, people were so horrified that they all backtracked in reverse. And this is like in 1959. But you had a double-deck concrete viaduct cutting off the Ferry Building from the rest of the city. And meanwhile, the Embarcadero, which early in the 20th century had been this major industrial port with all these busy finger piers, it was dying out, a variation of what happened to the Ferry Building, because technology said we need bigger ships, they need bigger berths, they need deeper water. And that's when the Port of Oakland came into existence. It was one of these things where it's like, what do? Do we tear it down? Do we tear down everything around it? What do we do with this thing? It's not part of our lives anymore, but we like it.
And then an earthquake came along.
Yeah, there is a symmetry to it. And it was 50 years after the building became a relic, an earthquake hits, and it didn't knock down the Embarcadero Freeway. It didn't hugely damage it, but it damaged it enough it would need to be closed by Caltrans to give it a seismic upgrade. And that in 1990 became the opening for everyone who hated the building. That became the opportunity for everybody who hated the Embarcadero Freeway to finally get the chance to tear it down. A really interesting part of San Francisco trivia is that 3 years before the 1989 earthquake, then Mayor Dianne Feinstein put a measure on the ballot to replace the Embarcadero Freeway with a surf promenade, very much like what we have now. But an opponent of that put an initiative on the ballot asking voters very simply, do you want to tear down the Embarcadero Freeway? And voters by a 60% margin said, no, keep the Embarcadero Freeway. So this thing that nobody can believe now it even existed, certainly if they're younger than 32 or 33 years old, it was just part of the landscape, and people, San Franciscans, loved the convenience of it as much as they said they hated everything else about it.
And yet the freeway came down in 91.
Yes, and that was one of the heroes of the book is Art Agnos, who was the mayor of San Francisco, and he was one of these state legislators who makes friends with every faction on the political scene, so he gets elected mayor by a wide margin in 1987. And then once he becomes mayor, he did a pretty good job alienating many of the factions who had supported him. But one thing was that he was not a big environmental mayor. He wasn't anti-environment. It just wasn't one of the issues he really put it front and center. But he became convinced by some of his assistants, this is your chance for a legacy. This is the right thing to do. You have the chance to push through the Board of Supervisors a motion to take down the freeway and get the feds to pay for the replacement. You've got to do it. And Agnos very sincerely came around to that point of view. It only passed the Board of Supervisors by a 6-5 vote because a lot of developers pushed it as a ruse for more towers on the waterfront. And then Chinatown merchants hated the idea. North Beach and Fisherman's Wharf merchants didn't like the idea. And so those two neighborhoods, which had voted overwhelmingly for Agnos in 1987, in the 1991 election, the year it actually came down, they voted pretty heavily for Frank Jordan, who became mayor. So Agnos to this day argues that that's the reason he lost the election.
When did the Embarcadero and the ferry building start to become revitalized? Obviously, long after the freeway was torn down in 91. What was it that gave impetus for the redevelopment?
There had been a number of attempts to redevelop the ferry building over the years, and they had all sputtered out because they were just bad plans or they were too expensive. The craziest was to tear it down and build a 40-story World Trade Center tower, and this is in 1948, long before New York's World Trade Center. So there were various efforts that went nowhere. Once the freeway came down, people were like, wow, look at this waterfront. What can we do with it in a very positive sort of way? By then you had Ghirardelli Square and the cannery get renovated, these two nice old brick complexes that had been turned into shops and whatnot. So there was an understanding that you could do creative urban renewal. Faneuil Hall existed in Boston, places like that. But once the Embarcadero Freeway came back down, people started rediscovering the Embarcadero, and the promenade was being put into place. And that allowed a few years, almost like kind of a breathing period, to really think about what do we want the ferry building to become? And the answer was we want it to be a destination for people. We want the historic preservation to be very meticulous, but we're comfortable with changing the interior in a lot of ways to make it attractive in a 21st century sense rather than a 19th century building. So essentially what you had was by the late 90s, you had the Embarcadero was really coming back. And it was real patchy, but it was just such a magnetic draw to people. And the city put out a request for redevelopment proposals on the ferry building, and it got 4 strong teams who all submitted pretty good proposals. And the city selected the one that kind of took the boldest strokes of really bringing major features of the interior back into existence. I'm not going to begin to try and describe to you all the ways the original building had just been erased. The developer who got selected, Wilson Meany Sullivan, restored the whole dramatic skyline sweep from north to south and that openness, which had been filled in with office space in the 50s and 60s. Cheap office space very quickly because it was crummy office space. And then, turn the ground floor, which had been like baggage storage areas and things like that, into this retail arcade. Part of where the shops are now was an indoor garage for Port of San Francisco maintenance vehicles into the mid-90s. That's what it used to be like.
Was there anyone from the city or the Board of Supervisors that shared the vision, that was visionary at all in terms of what it could become? Was it totally the developer? And what pushback was there even to that?
Mm-hmm. The vision of what it could become, the developer worked within a pretty tightly set parameter. And that was one thing that dawned on me working on the book, is that you look at all these unbuilt things and you can think, wow, just one flop after another. But in fact, they became kind of a way of framing what is it we do want. So the developers all were kind of given this pretty tight marching orders in terms of the retail need. The ground floor needs to be visitor retail oriented. You can do this to the building, but you can't do that. There was no specific visionary. There was more a lot of people who really cared about the waterfront, and they jointly kind of sweated through all these civic committees and charrettes and workshops and whatnot. And so the personnel changed, but the vision itself got sharper and sharper and sharper, which I think really turned out to be a good thing.
And talk about the ferry building today, which just went through a kind of renovation of sorts.
Mm-hmm. The building reopened in 1993, fully restored and reinvented. And from the start, it was this building that instantly embodied how a large part of San Francisco saw itself. We're a city that we respect our setting. We love the interplay of city and nature, but we also are tied to this larger region with a national bounty, and it's locally sourced, and it's from the ground up, and it's artisanal, and it's diverse. And, so it kind of hit the ground running. It was coming out of the dot-com bust and the early 90s recession. So, the business side of the equation was shaky for the first year or two, but people loved it. They just loved coming back. And then with time, the question was, is it too precious? Is it this or that? But it just kept going. It was almost always completely full. It changed hands once or twice. The lease of it changed hands once or twice. And when the pandemic hit, everything turned on its head, just like it did everywhere else. And you saw lots of tenants leave. The farmers market outside that's on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, which is a huge piece of the success story because it really gave the building this kind of authentic sense of connection to the ongoing city life. Those people really struggled. So it really got hit hard by the pandemic, but unlike Union Square or the financial district or other parts, it has slowly but steadily come back very well. There aren't many vacancies there now. There are lots and lots of people in there. The Saturday Farmers Market is pretty much what it was before the pandemic. I happened to go into the building yesterday around dusk, and there was this family coming out of it, and the little girl was like, there were a lot of people in the ferry building. She would not have said that if she was walking down Powell Street in Union Square.
And then there's a plan to redo the internal plaza of it in the not-too-distant future.
There are lots of plans underway on what to do with that area and the surrounding. The current developer who owns the lease, Hudson Pacific, they want to create more dining space. They want to play with the layout of the building and have more things coming from inside spilling outside. So far, they haven't made any real push because every time they start to kind of gingerly put a project forward, it gets such flack from historic preservation groups and a lot of watchdog groups that they pull back to tinker with it more. So that hasn't really been pursued strongly, but it's out there. There's a big plaza behind the ferry building on the water side.
Right.
That only exists because BART needed to build a ventilation shaft when the system was built in the late 60s. And so there's a building that hides a ventilation shaft. And then there's the plaza that connects to that. It's not a good plaza. Nobody ever thinks about it or goes there except when the Saturday Farmers Market is on. So everybody agrees something ceremonial should be done with that, but nobody really knows where the money would come from. And then the huge issue is the San Francisco Embarcadero has to be adapted to face the challenge of sea level rise.
What plans are there, or what conversations, I guess, are there at the moment about that?
To give the Port of San Francisco credit, it has been very seriously pursuing the question of how do we seismically reinforce the Embarcadero and do it in such a way that we're taking into account sea level rise projections beyond 2100. And the city's voters in 2018 approved $425 million to start doing early projects and things. Now, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers supposedly this winter will release a plan in conjunction with the city on kind of its first take on what physically to do. And if it becomes a federal project, that opens up the door to, billions of federal dollars, which is a long way of saying nobody quite knows what to do because the Embarcadero is an artificial shoreline. It dates back, basically an engineer drew a line on a map in 1875 and then crews just methodically over the decades dumped rubble into ditches in the mud and built these kind of stubby pyramids that were then capped with concrete. That's the seawall. And it survived 2 major earthquakes, but who knows how strong it is. The engineering surveys all suggest there are things that don't work that well in it and make it susceptible to major damage in a large earthquake. And then the height of it was just enough to get above the high tides in 1880, which is much different from what future projections are. So the ferry building, which sits on 5,912 piles of Oregon pine, it's just a few feet above the water. And if you look at the projections to the end of the century, any big storm would really send water surging over there and conceivably down into the Muni Tunnel and BART Tunnel and things like that. So the question is, how do you do a major upgrade looking a century into the future, but not destroy the livability and attractiveness that makes the Embarcadero such a destination for people?
And what's so fascinating is that the iconography of the building has not just survived, but been restored, that it is so representative once again of San Francisco.
You are absolutely right. There's a current series streaming by Jennifer Garner that I haven't seen, but a friend was telling me about it, and she's an artist with a studio in the ferry building. You have, in the new shows that are done, that's a part of San Francisco people want to use because it instantly says this is part of San Francisco. Even if it's shot in Vancouver or whatever, they'll get the shots of the people standing on the Embarcadero with the ferry building in the background and things like that. Similarly, if you look at all the tourist memorabilia, the tote bags and things, you will tend to see the Golden Gate Bridge, the Transamerica Pyramid, the Ferry Building, Coit Tower. Salesforce Tower, not as much. There's this small, maybe Sutro Tower. There's this small handful of icons. And the Ferry Building is the one that connects the 19th century with the 21st century. And not just in a, look at that cute thing over there, or in the case of Sutro Tower, look at that weird thing up there, but as, oh yeah, I've been there. I've gone to that building. I've done this or that in that building. That's a great building. It's part of San Francisco. There's nothing like it in any other city.
John King, his book is Portal, San Francisco's Ferry Building and the Reinvention of American Cities. John, I thank you so very much for spending time with us.
Well, thanks for great questions. You really were making me think.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and joining us here on the California Sun Podcast. I hope you'll join us next week. I'm Jeff Schechtman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.